10 o'clock on the 28th of September, an exhausted, mud-spattered rider arrived at Nonsuch Palace. He rushed up the grand stairs, through the garden presence chambers, pushing his way past startled gentlemen ushers and outraged ladies-in-waiting, and burst, unannounced, into the Queen's bedchamber. There he found Elizabeth, newly risen and still in her nightgown, without her wig, her makeup, and her ruff. It was a sight that no man had seen in 30 years. Elizabeth the woman, without the trappings of Gloriana the Queen. And the man who had thus violated the image of Elizabeth's monarchy was Robert Devereux, Earl of Essex.
It was an extraordinary affront to the Queen's honour. Essex had returned in panic, convinced that Cecil was engineering his downfall and desperate to plead his case. He was exhausted, ill, scarcely in his right mind. But the Queen was in no mood for forgiveness.
Elizabeth had stayed remarkably calm when Essex burst into her bedchamber. Later that afternoon, the Earl was summoned for a private audience with the Queen, which quickly turned into an interrogation. Why, Elizabeth wanted to know, had he left Ireland without permission? Why had he made so many knights in defiance of his express instructions? Why, above all, had he made a truce with that rebel and traitor Tyrone? The Earl answered as best he could, and then Elizabeth was left alone to ponder what she should do. Towards 10 o'clock at night, she gave orders that the Earl was to be put under a form of house arrest. The fall of the favourite had begun.
Essex was summoned before a public tribunal. He spent 11 hours on his knees, whilst a list of his delinquencies was read out in front of an invited audience. But even now, the Queen could not bring herself to destroy her disgraced favourite completely. Instead, she sent him into a sort of limbo. She ordered him not to attend the Privy Council. She banned him from her presence. And she refused to renew his lucrative monopoly on sweet wines, which threatened him with bankruptcy. Essex was released to his London residence, Essex House. He was down, but he wasn't quite finished yet. He would make one final, desperate bid for power. He would rebel.
A scheme was quickly hatched. The Earl would capture the City of London and the Tower. The Queen would be forced to summon a Parliament and to impeach Robert Cecil, and Essex would be declared Lord Protector of England. It was a harebrained scheme, but it might just work. The Earl's military followers would provide the backbone of an army, and Essex was so popular with the people of London that he was confident that they would rise in his support.
Essex wrote to James, seeking his support for the rising. The Scots king was too careful to commit himself, but sent Essex a reply in code and dispatched 2 envoys to meet him. Essex had already done his deal with the rebel Tyrone, would back the Earl's rising, it was said, in exchange for power over Ireland. And he had the support of one of the London sheriffs, as well as 5 other disaffected nobles. To call the people of London to arms, Essex's henchmen bribed Shakespeare's company to stage a performance at the Globe. Essex chose the play. It was Richard II.
This sceptred isle, this earth of majesty, this seat of Mars, this precious stone set in the silver sea is now bound in with shame, with inky blots and rotten parchment bonds. that England that was wont to conquer others hath made a shameful conquest of itself.
John of Gaunt is lamenting nostalgically for a lost England, a great country fallen into ruin. The stage is set for the deposition of a corrupt and overweening monarch by a once favoured and faithful nobleman. The audience were a mixed lot: adventurers, ex-soldiers, papists, malcontents. But they shared a common resentment for Elizabeth and her England, or was it Robert Cecil's England? And they had a common loyalty to the only conceivable alternative, Robert Devereux, Earl of Essex.
Early the following morning, Elizabeth received a report that Essex had left his house at the head of a private army. They were marching up Fleet Street, calling the people of the city to arms. For the first time, Elizabeth was in personal danger in her own capital. The rebels were just 2 miles from the court. She acted quickly, ordering her forces to block the route to the palace by building a barricade near Charing Cross. She sent royal heralds through the city proclaiming Essex a traitor. The sight of government troops and the herald's cry of treason made Londoners think twice. They stayed behind closed doors. Essex's force was confronted by troops belonging to the Bishop of London. Essex's page and 2 others were killed. By nightfall, the rebels were in retreat, their hands or cloaks covering their faces to try to avoid recognition. Essex himself panicked and fled back towards Essex House. He barricaded himself in and set about destroying incriminating evidence, including James's coded letter, whilst outside the Queen's forces trained cannon on the house. At 10 p.m, he surrendered. He was arrested, along with 85 of his co-conspirators, including the Earl of Southampton, Shakespeare's patron. When she received the news, Elizabeth retired to bed.